I would like to welcome you all to the Emerging Leaders Program, Regional Perspectives on the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. My name is Beck Strading. I'm the Executive Director of La Trobe Asia here at La Trobe University. And I would like to begin this event by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which La Trobe University sits. And I would like to pay respect to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to Indigenous Australians who might be with us this evening. We've put together an exciting program for you, including 7 masterclasses on a range of different topics and an academic dialogue on regional perspectives on the free and open Indo-Pacific with a range of fantastic experts from Australia and across the region. I really hope that you will have a great experience in this program. I've seen that there's been lots of comments on the WhatsApp thread and lots of sharing of events and news articles, and it's really terrific to see. And I just hope that you have the opportunity to develop your networks and to ask our experts pressing questions that you might have about foreign and defence policy in our region. So welcome to the program, and also welcome to our first masterclass. And I'm really delighted to welcome our first speaker in the series, Mr. Richard Maude. Richard is the Executive Director of Policy at Asia Society Australia and a Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He has 30 years experience in foreign policy and national security, including as the Deputy Secretary of the Indo-Pacific Group in DFAT and Australia's senior official to the East Asia Summit. I'm sure that many of you here are familiar with the Australian government's 2017 foreign policy white paper, which was actually prepared by a task force that was headed by Richard. He has also fulfilled the role of the Director General of the Office of National Assessments and was a senior advisor on foreign policy and national security issues to former Prime Minister Julia Gillard. I think we would be very hard pressed to find somebody more qualified or experienced to talk about diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific than Richard. So Richard, we are really grateful that you have joined us tonight to kick off our masterclass series for this program. So Richard will speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then I will chair the audience Q&A. So please feel free throughout Richard's presentation to write your questions in the chat, or alternatively, hold on to your questions until the presentation is over, and I will ask our audience members to raise their hands or to jump into the conversation to ask their questions. But for now, I will hand the virtual microphone over to Richard, and I'll ask Kate to share her screen so we can get some slides up. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Beck, and hello everyone. It's a really great pleasure to have a chance to talk to you tonight, and also really looking forward to hearing your questions and your own observations about the subject matter. I was saying to Beck that the topic that as she set it and her exam questions that she gave me really actually made me think quite hard, because I spend quite a lot of my time thinking and talking about foreign policy, but I actually spend less time thinking about diplomacy. And I did a fair bit of diplomacy in my time, but I never really thought much about the theory and practice of it, and perhaps really didn't think actually much about the context or culture within which I was operating. It was all, I think, internally absorbed. So it was a good chance actually to think about diplomacy, and particularly diplomacy in this part of the world. So there's 3 things I'm going to cover, hopefully romp through it in about 20 minutes so we can get to the Q&A session. So Kate, if you could just flick to the next slide. Eloise, by the way, I hope you're proud of me. I did these myself. They're not that schmick, but they're not bad either. So the 3 things I wanted to talk about was Beck asked me to talk about the foundations of diplomacy. That's a really big subject. You can do entire degrees on that. So I'm going to just have a very few introductory thoughts here. Then I wanted to talk a bit about diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, some of the ideas around diplomatic culture in the Indo-Pacific, the norms and principles that Indo-Pacific countries try to pursue, and a bit about the diplomatic architecture in the region. And then lastly, I'll just conclude with some quick thoughts about Australian diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. So Kate, if you could just flick to the next slide. So here's a point that may or may not be obvious to you, but it goes to my opening comment about foreign policy and diplomacy, because they are actually distinct things, quite distinct things. So many of you, I hope, have heard of Alan Gingell, a very distinguished Australian foreign policy expert. And Alan has a poetic turn of phrase, and he says that the primary function of foreign policy, and I'm quoting him here, is to expand the international space within which the nation state can operate to increase its options and maximizes its choices. So that's what foreign policy tries to do. And diplomacy is about how you get there. It's about how you get things done. Alan sometimes describes diplomacy as the operating system of foreign policy. I've got a quote there from another former Australian diplomat, a senior diplomat called James Wise, who amongst other things was one of our ambassadors to Bangkok. And he put it this way: if foreign policy is about goals, objectives and strategy, then diplomacy is about means, methods and action. A couple of other quick thoughts about this distinction. So foreign policy can be pursued by peaceful or non-peaceful means. So wars are, in fact, one way of pursuing foreign policy and have often over history been used to pursue foreign policy objectives. Diplomacy, though, for our purposes tonight, is about the peaceful prosecution of a nation's interests. But I've got there a line which made me smile a bit when I wrote it, but I think it's important because peaceful doesn't necessarily mean nice. Diplomacy can be tough, really tough, and it's pretty tough at the moment. We'll get to that. So diplomacy can employ all sorts of measures short of war, some of which are by their very nature coercive. So diplomacy can be pretty tough. Kate, the next slide, please. So diplomacy, the history of diplomacy, which we don't have time for, is pretty interesting actually, but there are traditions and practices that we still do today that in some cases go back centuries. But for the purpose of the modern era, there was a thing called the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and that really codified the practice of diplomacy for the modern era and the sorts of rights and privileges that are afforded to diplomats when they're serving overseas. And the convention defined the core role of diplomats to be essentially 5 things: protecting the interests of what's known as the sending state, that is the diplomat's home country; promoting relations between the sending and the receiving state, that's the country in which the diplomat is operating; negotiations, reporting on developments, and also consular protections. And 40 years on from that convention, well, actually it's more than 40 years, isn't it? It's more like 60 years. Diplomats still perform many of those functions. And many of the tools and techniques used in diplomacy, like engagement, communication, negotiation, persuasion, and analysis, they've also stayed pretty constant through time. But there's a but to this. And Kate, if you could pull up the next slide, we'll just work through that but. And the but is that diplomacy is profoundly shaped by forces, external forces, global forces. And in recent decades, globalization and technological change, especially the communications revolution, have had really big impacts on the practice of diplomacy. So the core of diplomacy historically was about maintaining peace and security and facilitating commerce. But now when you think about diplomacy, there's this huge set of complex new issues on the agenda. all of which diplomats are engaged in: climate change and the environment, international health security, pandemics, well, a bit topical this year, things like the regulation of outer space, the building of norms around new technologies like the ethical use of artificial intelligence. And that's just a few examples of a much bigger and broader agenda that diplomats now grapple with. And one consequence of that expanding international agenda is that it's been a very long time since diplomacy was practiced by diplomats, what you might call traditional diplomats, just sitting in foreign ministries. So in Australia, you know, there would hardly be a government department in Canberra, if any, that don't have an international agenda of one sort or another. And many of them, of course, have their own people posted in Australia's missions overseas. Another consequence of that expanding agenda is that the line that was already pretty blurry between foreign policy and domestic policy has been even more strongly blurred. And on many issues these days, there is a continuum between domestic policy and foreign policy, and it's really hard to find a sensible break in between them. All that also means that diplomats perform those core roles set out in the Vienna Convention, but they do a whole bunch of other stuff. They're analysts, they're policy developers, they're coalition builders, they're negotiators, they're election campaign managers, they're crisis responders, they're development assistance experts, they're trade experts, they're international law experts, and so on. And these days, and here I'd be a big foul, I have to say, but modern diplomats are also expected to master the art of public diplomacy on Twitter and Facebook. So there are more officials conducting diplomacy of various types, but diplomats also share a much more crowded international stage these days. There are more individuals and organizations because of globalization that influence the way the world works, and diplomacy has to accommodate or at least recognize these. So companies and business leaders, international lawyers, non-government organizations, big global institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, UN peacekeepers, officials working in supranational organizations like the European Union, or transnational organizations like ASEAN, even the leaders of some of the world's biggest cities. These are all international actors in their own right. A couple of other quick points on this session. One is that the globalization and tech change have really increased the pace of diplomacy. And in doing a bit of reading for this talk, I stumbled across a wonderful quote from Thomas Jefferson when he was the US president. And he allegedly said at one point to his Secretary of State, this quote, he said, "We've heard nothing from our ambassador in Spain for 2 years. If we don't hear from him for another year, let us write him a letter." Now, this was the very early 1800s, but the world in which you could be posted overseas and have very little contact with your foreign ministry and government lingered for a surprisingly long time after that. But today, of course, diplomats operate in real time. They're expected to respond in real time. The world of diplomacy is 24/7. And governments have very high expectations for quick action on breaking issues, and especially when a crisis is happening. And while secure communication remains a critical part of diplomacy, so too are smartphones and encrypted messaging apps. And in fact, one of the features of diplomacy in Asia is just how much of it is conducted on WhatsApp. If you're a diplomat in Asia and you're not on WhatsApp, you may as well not exist. And one interesting consequence of this is that it allows political leaders and ministers to conduct a lot more diplomacy personally, straight to their counterparts, bypassing foreign ministries in a way that never used to happen. There's one interesting exception to that rule, which is that in my experience, I don't think any Australian leader or foreign minister has ever been able to communicate directly with their Chinese counterparts via smartphone. I think I'm right in that. And I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if any country has that capacity to do it. I suspect the Chinese system just doesn't allow it. Okay, so that's a very potted take on the foundations of diplomacy. So let's now look at diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. And Kate, thank you for that. Yeah, so I was asked to try and answer the question, does diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific differ to diplomacy elsewhere? And not in the basics. So communication, engagement, negotiation, they're all uniform, universal. But diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific is definitely shaped by geography, history, politics, economics, and culture of the region. And here I offer a few quick points. One is the incredible diversity of the region. The heterogeneity of it is probably greater than any other region in the world, of historical experience, of language, of culture, religion, size of countries, levels of development, forms of government, you name it. It's so incredibly diverse. And in such a diverse region, it's hard to talk about a common diplomatic culture, but there are certainly some characteristics worth mentioning. I'll just run quickly through a few. First of these is, this is a region where the state never went away. The power and the primacy of the nation state in international actors is still very much evident. There's nothing postmodern about the Indo-Pacific. The idea of Indo-Pacific countries ceding sovereignty in the way the EU does, for example, is just not contemplated. Second quick point, many of these countries, when their diplomacy is shaped by the legacies of colonialism and the Cold War, so they emphasize things like non-alignment and strategic autonomy. Third quick point, if it's possible to have a center for Indo-Pacific diplomacy in such a big region, it's Southeast Asia, and particularly the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And many of you will have heard of Southeast Asia talk about the importance of ASEAN centrality, the notion that Southeast Asia sits at the core of regional diplomacy. And the types of diplomatic norms that ASEAN promotes reflect the broader regional history and diplomatic character I've mentioned. So things that are important to ASEAN and many of ASEAN's partners: sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-interference in internal affairs, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and support for international law, including the law of the sea. And you'll find those kinds of norms in treaties like the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which many of ASEAN partners, including Australia, have signed. Kate, if you move to the next slide. Across the region, there are a gazillion different diplomatic forums and institutions, way too many to talk about here. So I just wanted to talk quickly about three types of Indo-Pacific diplomatic architecture that are really significant. The first of these are the big plurilateral trade deals that run through the region, and these are really important to Australia, and there are three in particular that complement our bilateral trade agreements. So the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, that's the oldest of these three. The second is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a trade agreement that has the 10 ASEAN countries at its core, and then another 5 or 6 countries attached to it, including Australia. And then the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, really hard to say. That's a smaller agreement, not centered on ASEAN, but it does have some Southeast Asia countries as a member. Not an agreement that, at least at the moment, has either the United States or China as a member, but Australia is, and we're hoping that agreement will enter into force soon. And these bigger trade agreements reflect our own very strong interest in being part of economic integration with the region and in building rules-based trading systems in Asia. Increasingly, they have geopolitical significance as well as economic one. The second of these three types of diplomatic architecture is the ASEAN-centered architecture I mentioned. This is really important. The centerpiece of that is the East Asia Summit, Beck mentioned at the top. That's really important because it's a leader-led forum. It meets at the level of leader and it's not too big, and the right countries are around the table. But there's a whole bunch of others of these. APEC, not strictly an ASEAN-centered forum, but all 10 members are in it. The ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus. And then most of ASEAN's key partners, including Australia, have an ASEAN +1 dialogue. And then Japan, China, and Korea have an ASEAN +3 dialogue. All those forums are places for dialogue and for modest cooperation on things like maritime security, international law, the health of the oceans, connectivity, and so on. They do help air difficult issues, and they do try to build support for norms of behaviour in the region. But none of them were built to manage this very intense period of major power competition we're experiencing, and they're all consensus-based groupings, and that limits what they can do. So the third is something totally different, which is an emerging alignment countries interested in balancing China's power in the Indo-Pacific. And this is represented most strongly by the rebirth of the quadrilateral security dialogue, which is very much in the news recently because it's just had a leaders meeting in Washington. And by its very nature, the Quad bypasses ASEAN-centered architecture, and that does lead to some anxiety in ASEAN that it's going to remain central, but not actually that relevant to the biggest challenges the region faces, which is managing strategic competition. And there's a very tough jostling for advantages, as I'm sure you know now, in the region. And in addition to the Quad, that's driving new forms of diplomacy. So it's only relatively recently that you hear countries talk about health diplomacy or face mask diplomacy or infrastructure diplomacy and cyber diplomacy. So they're all driven by this major power competition. I haven't listed track 1.5 or track 2 diplomacy in this list, but such mechanisms do operate across the Indo-Pacific, and Australia does use them. Track 1.5 and track 2 are sort of unofficial processes, and they're sometimes used where formal relations are tense, or you want to try and make progress on a very sensitive issue, but you can't do it in a formal process. Okay, to stick to my 20 minutes, I need to finish up now. So let's go to the last slide and just talk about an Australian perspective on Indo-Pacific diplomacy. And there are a number of elements that make Australian diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific different from some other regions. The first of these is the sheer scale and extent of our national interests. So our security and our prosperity rest fundamentally on what happens in this part of the world. The Indo-Pacific is the source of our greatest economic opportunity and also our greatest risks and our greatest challenges, especially managing our troubled relationship with China and thinking about what kind of regional order might develop as China becomes more powerful. Our diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific operates on multiple issues at multiple levels all at once. And the apex of this diplomacy is to try and secure what our Prime Minister has called a balance favourable to freedom, or in the more utilitarian words of our Foreign Minister, a strategic balance in which no single power, no single dominant power dictates outcomes for others. And it's hard to imagine a more challenging and more all-encompassing foreign policy objective for Australia than this, really since the end of the Second World War. And to try and get to that, we're employing all arms of statecraft, all forms of diplomacy, our aid program, our defence cooperation, our political and economic cooperation. So understandably, second point, the Indo-Pacific is where we weight our diplomatic resources. Nearly all of our biggest embassies and high commissions are here. There are more diplomatic staff in this region. This is where our aid budget operates. This is where the weight of our defence cooperation operates, and so on. The third point is that we like to think in this region we have more agency and influence than we would say in Europe or Africa. A fourth point, because of all those factors, we produce a lot of policy focused on the Indo-Pacific. So if you're a diplomat sitting in a post, even a small one in the Indo-Pacific, or you're working on Indo-Pacific issues in Canberra, you're busy. You're really busy. And if you think about the past couple of years of policy, the Pacific Step Up, the regearing of Australia's aid program for the pandemic, the various vaccines initiatives, the completion of those trade deals, the upgrading of the relationship with India, the Quad, AUKUS, and so it goes on. Fifth point, we're deeply embedded in the regional architecture, as we've just talked about. And then last, my very last point, promise I'll stop now. We do try to invest in cultural competency because we do think it's a key part of successful diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. Now, you've got to recognise here that we do often come to the Pacific and to Asia with baggage. You know, the white Australia policy, the colonial past in the Pacific, sometimes a perception that we're tied too closely to the United States, sometimes initiative fatigue, that Australia just brings too many ideas to the region. And it's also true that we're often very hard-nosed about the pursuit of our national interest in the Indo-Pacific, and that too can create friction at times. But on the whole, I do think, and from my own experience, that we do put people in the Indo-Pacific who get the region, who understand it and who work with the grain. And that means languages, it means history, it means seeing issues from the perspective of the region, even if ultimately you have a different policy decision. It means patience, respect for seniority, courtesy in public. All those things that go to diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific are really important, really worth investing in, and worth learning, whether you're a diplomat or just someone who wants to visit the region or engage in the region or see yourself with a business career working with the region. So Beck, I think I blew my limit by 3 minutes, but I'm going to stop.
That's all right. That's a terrific start to the conversation. There is a lot to unpack. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to forego my asking questions of you because I can see that we have a few in the chat already. So I might invite Ash, would you unmute yourself and ask Richard the first question to kick off our Q&A?
No worries. Hi, Richard. Thanks for your time. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Kate. Thanks for everyone organising it. Oh, I've just gone off my camera. There we go. So my question, just to give you a bit of background, my dissertation is looking at the hybridization of Indonesian democracy and sort of the consolidation of Indonesian democracy, because it is quite a new democracy. And I was wondering the difference and the distinction between diplomacy with a democracy and diplomacy with an autocracy in the Indo-Pacific and how that differs. Are there any particular tactics? Are there any particular things to be aware of? Just wondering your insight into that. Thanks.
Yeah, really great question and a really topical one. My starting point is that the dominant determinant of diplomacy with a country is how much you have in common, how much your objectives are shared, whether they're a bilateral objective or a regional objective. There's a phrase in diplomacy, a much overused one, I'm afraid, called like-minded. You know, how like-minded are you with the country? And that determines diplomacy. It determines the shape of the bilateral relationship. It determines how much opportunity there is and also how much tension there is, much more than the type of the regime. So let me give you an example of that. No secret, we have an incredibly difficult relationship with China at the moment, a one-party authoritarian state. We have a really good relationship with Vietnam at the moment, a one-party authoritarian state. And that goes to the like-minded point. We find it that we have lots in common with Vietnam at the moment, bilaterally and regionally. And we also find that there are fewer issues that are putting friction in the gears of the relationship. Now, there are a couple of caveats to that. I don't think regime type is totally irrelevant. At the moment, I'm sure you're all aware, there is a clustering of democracies coming together. The Quad is a grouping of 4 democracies and is not afraid to say so. Joe Biden, the new American president, puts a lot of emphasis on cooperation in the democratic world. And he views democracies as being in a contest with the autocracies to prove that democracies are up to managing the challenges of the 21st century and also solving their internal problems and can compete. So that sense of democracies working together is really gathering pace, whether it's the Quad or the G7. And then my last point on this, I don't want to get lost in this because it's a very contested area, but I do think there are aspects of China's model of government, and particularly the Communist Party at the moment, the way it sees the world, the ideology that it sustains, that does create particular problems for countries like Australia. And therefore regime type is not completely irrelevant to the story that we've been talking about.
Just have a follow-up for you there, Richard, about the democracy, autocracy, and that is about the sort of rhetoric or the language that we use. Is there a risk for a country like Australia in talking about our kind of democratic values and identity that we might create problems for ourselves in countries, say in Southeast Asia, that are like-minded, Vietnam or Singapore, or countries that don't have democratic modes of government? Is there a sense that Australian foreign policy leaders need to differentiate their narratives to different audiences?
Yeah, I think very strongly, my view is that they should, and to some extent they do, but it does get lost in the rhetoric, which the sort of democracy and values rhetoric is, the dial is turned up to 11 for sure at the moment. And even I get tired of it, and I'm someone that, believes in liberalism and believes in democracy and believes that we are in an era where we do have to be clear about what we stand for. But Southeast Asia is totally disinterested in a competition of systems, right? They're not in that space. And it can alienate them and make them anxious and make them feel excluded. And we're much better off in Southeast Asia and in some other parts of the region, instead of banging on about shared values when often they don't exist, and talking about shared principles. And it's not hard actually to come up with a list of shared principles that most countries in the region want to live by. I mentioned some of them at the top. So peaceful resolution of disputes, the sort of not trying to resolve disputes by force or the threat of force or through coercion. The importance of international law, including the law of the sea. So these are principles that I think that we can talk about in the region, and countries are very comfortable signing up to them. And indeed, they're embedded not just in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation that I mentioned earlier, but in a document called the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, AOIP. I don't know whether any of the audience tonight have come across the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, but you'll find it pretty quickly on the internet. It's an interesting document because it's ASEAN's attempt to have a say in this very tough contest that's going on in the region. So yeah, we can overdo it for sure.
Jaya, I might ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for your presentation. I just wanted to get some of your thoughts on how you think Australia will go about balancing its involvement in the Quad with the concept of ASEAN centrality. I mean, do you think it has the potential to sort of upset the balance of that concept and alienate countries like Indonesia, who have such an influential position in that ASEAN framework?
Yeah, there's definitely a tension there. And the more the Quad develops, the harder that balancing act that you rightly identify becomes. Indonesians and other Southeast Asians are anxious, a little bit anxious about the Quad. They're anxious about AUKUS as well. That anxiety works on multiple levels. One is they do recognise that, as I said, that in some ways the big agenda of managing competition with China is now just moving around them. And they sense that, and they worry about it because they don't just want to be central, they don't just want people turning up to their meetings, but they also want to be relevant. And they know that they risk losing relevance. The second reason why that makes them anxious is that they don't know what to do about that. Because ASEAN's very firm view is that it wants to stay out of major power competition. It doesn't want to pick sides. It's not going to be forced to pick sides, and it really just wants America and China to sort it out. And that's not that. Them sorting it out is not going to happen anytime soon. So, they struggle themselves to know what role ASEAN can play in this. The third reason, they're genuinely anxious, I think, about the risk of competition tipping into conflict because they know that would be disastrous. So can Australia square that circle or walk and chew gum, to mangle my metaphors here? Yeah, look, I think we can. I think we can, but it's going to take a lot of hard work. And that hard work includes making sure that the attention that we devote to the Quad doesn't begin to overshadow the attention we devote to Southeast Asia and ASEAN. That means being in the region. It means our ministers have got to travel. It means we can't keep cutting our aid budget, and so on and so forth. And so, our engagement with Southeast Asia during the pandemic has waxed and waned, and there are some reasons for that. But we are at the point now where we've just got to get back to our A game in the region and be there and be very engaged.
That's a really good question. And you did mention AUKUS. So I feel like I can't let you go, Richard, without asking you about the diplomacy around AUKUS and whether you can give us a sense of your views about how particularly the announcement kind of unfolded a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, well, a couple of quick thoughts. One is Malaysia and Indonesia have expressed concern. And of course, from an Australian government perspective, we'd want to be doing everything. And in fact, the system is now doing everything we can to try and answer the questions they have and to offer reassurance about it. And some of the concerns that are rattling around Indonesia and Malaysia are actually answerable. They're about our commitment to non-proliferation under the NPT, etc. They're about an arms race, which is a bit of a ludicrous thing to accuse Australia of, given the massive arms build-up and modernisation that China's been pursuing. So some of those concerns are answerable. Overall, though, I'd say that the Indonesian reaction in particular has been less significant than we've seen at some other points where we've had bad reactions from Indonesia, less significant than the Prime Minister's rather ill-advised foray into Middle East diplomacy when he said we were going to move our embassy to Jerusalem, which really did get up the noses of the Indonesians because it's a totemic issue for them. Less significant than when Julia Gillard and Barack Obama announced the first stage of the forced posture initiative that eventually saw Marines training in Darwin and the build-up of US sort of joint military infrastructure there. So it's got to be measured against other points. The reaction elsewhere has either been neutral or in the case of Singapore, really quite strikingly relaxed. So I'd say if you were sitting in government right now, you would want to be doing everything you could to reassure Indonesia and Malaysia, and for the rest of it, you'd be fairly happy with where things landed. The big problem with the diplomacy, of course, is that the diplomats couldn't do what they would normally want to do, which is to go in much earlier than they had. So everybody got essentially last minute notice, including the French. But same was true in the region, and the region likes more notice than that. You know, they feel that they're owed it. Indonesia in particular has a strong sense of itself these days and believes that the respectful thing to do is for partners to give people reasonable warning. And in this instance, simply because of the nature of the way in which the decision was made and announced, there was some notice, but not as much as everyone would have liked.
It's interesting though. The French are part of the Indo-Pacific region as well. Of course, we share a maritime boundary with the French through New Caledonia. But I might ask Henrietta to ask her question, because it gets to the heart of how we conceptualize the region. So Henrietta, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I was just wondering, often the Pacific gets ignored in this broader Indo-Pacific dialogue. And I was wondering what your thoughts were around different ways of engaging diplomatically between Asia and the Pacific, particularly given there are different architectures, different needs, different interests, and how that works for you.
Yeah, another great question. Look, I think the reality is that they're just such two separate worlds that they're not really going to interact in any significant institutional way, although they do a bit in the United Nations. I think, you know, that's one exception where often, you know, if you think broadly of the developing world or the South, where Pacific countries will often group together with and align with the developing countries of Southeast Asia. And I think, you know, mostly when Asia gets engaged in the Pacific, it's with particular agendas in mind. So Indonesia has a particular agenda, for example, to fend off Papuan membership of the Melanesian Islands grouping, the sub-regional grouping. Japan is active in the Pacific as part of this broader balancing agenda that's running across the region. India is interested because it sees itself as a global power, but also because it has there's a big Indian community in Fiji, for example, and it tends to be those kinds of national interest points that drive intersection. I think there's one country where I wish we could find a fix for, and that's actually Timor-Leste, because poor old Timor-Leste sits in between the Pacific and Southeast Asia, but belongs to neither of the regional groupings, and it's trying to get into ASEAN with support from Australia. Actually, not that we get a vote, and it may happen, but there are a number of countries in ASEAN who are very reluctant to see the group expand further.
It's interesting, the Timor example, because often ASEAN is conflated with Southeast Asia, but it's not really the case as long as Timor-Leste is excluded from ASEAN.
Right.
But I might ask Brianna to ask your question.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for speaking to us tonight. I just wanted to ask, recently Alan Gingell and Darren Lem spoke a little bit in their podcast, Australia in the World, about the merits of face-to-face diplomacy post-COVID, if that's even a thing. I'm wondering, do you see video conferencing, the era of Zoom, replacing any of the methods for conducting diplomacy going forward?
Not replacing. Look, the pandemic has accelerated the digitization of diplomacy, as it has accelerated the digitization of so many other parts of our life. And I do think that that is going to be a permanent shift, but I don't see Zoom conferencing replacing face-to-face diplomacy. In fact, the longer we get into the pandemic, the more you hear diplomats groaning and complaining, and not just diplomats, actually political leaders, about the limits of Zoom conferencing. There really is nothing like being there in person, and there really is nothing like being able to transact the amount of business you can transact when you go on a bilateral visit, or you go to a big multilateral meeting like the East Asia Summit. And for all leaders who go to the East Asia Summit, it's not just about the couple of hours they spend in the summit, which is a pretty pro forma experience, I have to tell you. It's the multitude of meetings they do on the sidelines. So, you know, they might still, who knows, they might still say no, but Scott Morrison hasn't been able to get to a meeting, a multilateral meeting, where he might have bumped into either Xi Jinping or the Chinese Premier, because they haven't been held. So he hasn't got to APEC or the East Asia Summit, for example. And that's often, that kind of face-to-face diplomacy can often be really, really important. So I think there'll be more Zoom conferencing, there'll be less travel, but face-to-face is still, it really can't be replaced.
Absolutely. We run track 1.5 dialogues here at the Trobe Asia, and we've been running them virtually, and have to agree that it's the kind of incidental conversations that you have, you know, around the sandwich table when it's face-to-face that can often be the most illuminating when you're talking with other people. So Tom, our friend Tom, who used to work with us at the Trobe Asia, it's great to see you. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That was really interesting, and cheers to the La Trobe Asia for organising the program. Good to see everyone. So you touched on before briefly on Australia's aid budget being kind of cut back over the last couple of years, and speaking about AUKUS, like the flip side of that obviously was the French submarine contract getting canned, and apparently costing about $4 billion. I've seen floating around a figure that has already been spent on it with like nothing to show for it. So I was just thinking, like, what do you think that says about Australia's priorities in terms of tools of its statecraft that it uses? Like, is that showing that maybe diplomacy is becoming securitized, or is it more just the fact that Australia's strategic environment is kind of deteriorating?
Yeah, well, that's another great question. And it's good you asked it, because I was going to touch on this in my original conception of my notes, but I got lost in Indo-Pacific architecture. So I didn't want to take any much more time. Look, I think the subs decision and in fact, actually all of our defence spending should be thought of, in my view, separately from the funding we put into diplomacy. Anything we do in the defence space is hideously expensive, and we waste a frightening amount of money. But whether it's 12 conventional French submarines or 8 nuclear submarines, which, by the way, are probably going to cost more than the 12 conventional submarines by the time we're done, or joint strike fighters, or future frigates, you know, we are going to spend a lot more money on our defence, and we're in a world now where we should, in my view. But we should also be able to walk and chew gum, and I am dismayed by the political unwillingness to stand up for the aid budget. And I think, particularly at the moment, if ever we were in a moment, given what the pandemic has done to large parts of Asia, you know, the World Bank and ADB put out regular stats on poverty, and for the first time in 2 or 3 decades, we're seeing significant increases in poverty, millions of people pushed back into poverty, inequality rising, disproportionate impacts on women and girls, long-term scarring that's going to take many countries a long time to overcome. So if ever there was a moment where the humanitarian imperative is there, it's now. And in addition, the aid budget is really also a tool of statecraft. So if we're about competing with China, if we're about bolstering our own influence and standing in the region, then we shouldn't penny pinch on it. And particularly in Southeast Asia, which really has borne the brunt of many of the cuts, we're just underdone. Now, having said that, the government did pump a lot of money into DFAT and into aid programs at the end of last year. A lot of that went in vaccines, which was really great to see. So, kudos for the government for doing that and for recognising the need. But they're still so worried about the badging of this that it's billed as a temporary supplement to the aid program. I think I'm advocating for more, not less, and I'm not the only one. And hopefully the government will see the need, but we should have a better funded aid program, and we should also have a better funded foreign ministry.
I'm wondering, Richard, about our kind of Asia literacy and capabilities as well. Asian studies programs are sort of under attack a little bit in tertiary sector. Are these things that really need to be considered by government, whether it's, funding them or whether it's trying to incentivize people to better understand the region?
Yeah, look, I think it's a big issue myself, and it's one that, sorry, I keep bumping my table and shaking the laptop. I think it's one that a number of people in the bureaucratic system here in Canberra are conscious of and worried about. Whether there's government appetite to do anything about it, I'm not sure. It is a hard problem to crack. The problem of languages starts at schools, as you would know, Beck. And getting Australian kids to study Asian languages is just getting much harder to do. And there are some reasons for that are kind of understandable, but it's harder to do. Once you start getting down to a small number of teachers, you get into a kind of vicious circle. So schools, it's reaching crisis point for some languages like Indonesian now. And then, of course, the way government thinks about universities and the courses it's prepared to subsidise and the pricing signals it sends, it doesn't incentivise universities to do history and culture of Asia as much as they should do. So I worry about it. I think it's an issue for us. I'm not sure how much appetite this government has to delve into it, but maybe a future government will be prepared to look at it.
Thank you. Nicholas, are you there? Do you want to ask a question?
Hello, thanks, Beck. And I watched you present at the AIIA forum a couple of weeks back, and it was fabulous, and it's excellent to see you again tonight.
Oh, thank you.
And that's all right. And also thank you for the presentation tonight. If I may, actually, I'd like to pass my time to Eloise. I think it was an excellent question she just posted in the chat just then, and much better than my own one, which I fear is not that exciting or interesting for anyone here except myself. So Eloise, I'm going to steal yours if that's okay. And it was a request for a story. You mentioned diplomacy being peaceful but not always nice. Could you share one of your most diplomatically challenging experiences as a senior diplomat in the region, trying to push forward Australia's foreign policy agenda? And thank you, Eloise, for the save, because I wasn't confident in my question at all. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, look, I've had a few. I I've had a few not nice moments. There are some limits to which I should talk about them, but I did 2 years as Deputy Secretary covering Indo-Pacific, and I had a lot of encounters with China during that time, including the rather long-suffering Chinese ambassador to Australia, who's actually a very decent person, but has an impossible job, and his job is to shout at us. And we had some very tough exchanges where no quarter was given, and the sort of exchange that you wouldn't normally expect diplomats to have. And apart from the challenging nature of that, those encounters spoke to the broader problem we have with China, which is that we're speaking past each other. Each side holds the other totally responsible for the current state of events, and each side wants the other to move first. And that was kind of the nature of my conversations. I have had other tough moments. I've got to say that some of the toughest moments I've had have been inside government. Speaking of diplomacy within government, when you get to the top of the system, it can be very competitive. Prime ministers can be very impatient and often don't like it when you speak truth to power. So that can be, as the joke goes, character building, but always something that you can learn from. I've had to deliver some really awful news, some really bad, disappointing news to senior representatives of countries from time to time. News that we're not going to support them in something, or that something that they're very keen for us to do is just not going to happen. I've had to speak to individuals, often Australian citizens, who are in states of distress, in very difficult situations overseas or at home. When I was working for Julia Gillard, I often had to speak to the families who'd had sons killed in Afghanistan. I suppose I'll leave you with one last sort of happier experience of a really, really tough exchange where I was just watching, and that was between Julia Gillard and the Turkish President Erdogan. And this was in France, when France was hosting the G20 in Cannes, I think it was, from memory. And Turkey and Australia were battling to get in the queue to host the G20. And Turkey wanted Australia to give way in the year that we wanted to do it. And we had a bilateral with Erdogan, and he swaggered in with his all male delegation, and they slouched on their chairs in a slightly passive-aggressive male way. And Erdogan then started that conversation with the expectation that Gillard would give way and concede not just to Turkey, but to him. And she was like a rock, and he grew more and more frustrated and angry. He didn't completely lose control, but the idea that I think not just that Australia wouldn't concede to Turkey, but that Julia Gillard, a woman, would not concede to Erdogan was really getting up his nose. And that was very uncomfortable meeting to be in, very tense, but also a moment where I felt immense proud to be an Australian. And we did win that year to be the host, although, as fate would have it, it was Tony Abbott that got to host that meeting in Brisbane.
That is a really terrific story, really interesting. Now, we are a little bit over, but I'm hoping, Richard, you might have time for one more question, because there's a few questions still in the chat, but we have kind of covered a lot of the themes in those questions, but there's one that we haven't talked about. And so I'll ask Fergus to ask his question, if you don't mind taking one more.
Sure thing.
Thanks for that, Beck, and thanks for taking one more, Richard. My question is just about climate policy. Obviously, Australia has a bit of a reputation as a laggard on climate policy now. I just wanted to get your view on how much that reputation is hindering our pursuit of our key foreign policy objectives in the region. You know, building coalitions and balancing against China. Does that harm our efforts significantly or not? I guess specifically or especially in the South Pacific among Pacific Island countries?
Yeah, look, I think it does to some extent. It's hard to know just how much, but it's definitely been a real drag, you know, a millstone around our neck in the Southwest Pacific for sure. You know, it's an issue that the Pacific leaders are absolutely passionate about. It's existential for them, including Frank Bainimarama, who likes to poke us in the eye with it. And it's just an irritant that we could really do without. I think for quite a while, it was really only strongly noticeable in the Pacific and not really much of an issue elsewhere. But that, of course, has changed now. And that too is notable. You know, there really has been a couple of big shifts. The first one is Biden becoming president. You know, this is one of his signature things. He's deeply, deeply committed to it. He wants more ambition from everyone, including Australia, and the alliance will not protect us from that. And I think the government sees that. But it's not just America. We've seen a slew of countries make commitments to net zero by 2050, or in China's case by 2060. And so increasingly we absolutely look more isolated internationally, and there is more pressure, including from our closest partner, America, for Australia to up its ambition. And the ambition that people want to see for us is not just on the 2050 target, but on the near-term target by 2030. And, you know, I think the debate that you're now seeing unfolding inside the coalition, you know, kind of fascinating one, just from a political perspective in Australia, reflects that international pressure. I'd like to think it also reflects a realization that time is really running out now, as per the last big report from the Intergovernmental Climate Change Panel, which is pretty scary reading. But I also think it reflects the fact that we're just looking increasingly lonely on the international stage.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid that we are going to have to leave the discussion there, but Kate has sent me a message reminding me that we would like to take a group shot if everybody is okay with that. If you're not okay with that, please let me know now by raising your hand or getting my attention in some way. No, I think we're all good. Everybody smarten up the hair. Okay, Kate, go for it. Terrific. Well, thank you, Richard. That was truly a masterclass. It was a fascinating discussion touching on a range of really important issues. I'm sure that our members of the Emerging Leaders Program agree that it was a terrific start for the next couple of months. So we're really grateful, appreciative of you for coming in and talking with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Bet. A real pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed the conversation. Great question. So it just shows that all the people on this call are really plugged into what's happening in our region, and that's wonderful to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Terrific questions. As always, it's terrific to partner with Asia Society. So thank you for supporting the program. It's really looking forward to the next few sessions and the dialogue, which will be coming up at the end of October. So thank you, Richard, and thank you to all of you who have attended and engaged. And we look forward to seeing you at the next masterclass, which is Peter Dean. Is that right, Kate? Yes, Professor Peter Dean will be talking to us about defence in the Indo-Pacific. So we'll be taking a slightly different approach to understanding our region in that topic. So look forward to keeping up with you on the WhatsApp thread, and we'll see you at the second masterclass.
Thanks all. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Nicholas, are you there?
I am still, yes.
I just got your message. Yeah, I'm happy to stick around. I'm sorry, but I thought that you were talking, I don't know why I thought you were talking to me when you were talking about the AI event, because I did.
No,
do
I
one a
was.
couple
I
weeks. You
was. I
were?
was.
Oh,
I absolutely
okay.
was. I was thanking you for the AAA forum, which is probably poor practice, and also thanking Richard for his presentation, and I got lost somewhere at 1.5.
When you said that, I was like, thank you. And then I'm like, maybe he's not talking to me.
I definitely was. I definitely was.
Okay.
I think it's probably very late for both of us. So instead of talking tonight, if I could shoot you an email sometime and set up just 15 to 30 minutes,
Yeah.
I think we both got dinner to go to.
Yeah,
That would be awesome.
No problem. I'm happy to chat. So yeah, and thank you for your question and for the compliment.
No. Thank you for hosting, and thanks to Richard, even though he's not here.
Yeah, he was
Cheers.
terrific. That was great.
He was excellent. No worries. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Hey.
So good. Amazing.
Done, everyone. That was excellent. We're still recording, by the way.